Welcome everyone, speakers and audience, to this kind of retro prospect type of event, looking at the last 50 years ago to the founding of BISA and to where we are now in 2025 and what we might be expecting or fearing in the next 50 years as well. So I'd like to thank Juanita and Juliet for this invitation to chair this particular session. It's a really interesting one, and as we know, the 1970s are a pivotal decade in the making of where we are today in a number of different ways. And in preparation for this, in part, I was looking at the agenda of the 1975 conference, and when we look down the list of speakers, there are eerie echoes of the topics that they chose to speak about today. The keynote lecturer was Andrew Schonfield from Chatham House, and he spoke about the fragmentations of power. And I think people talk about the emergence of bloc politics, geopolitical competition, and fragmentation and so on, domestically and globally today. And that was quite interesting. But it also showed that, the BISA was founded, if you like, quite engaged in the policy world, with the director of Chatham House there giving the keynote address, and then being followed up in the area of technology by the chief scientific officer at the MOD, and then later on by someone who was Fred Hirsch, who was a financial journalist at the Economist and others, and a senior advisor to the IMF, to Edith Penrose, who had fought McCarthyism in the 1950s in the United States, defending her colleague Owen Lattimore, who was at Johns Hopkins at that time. And she also served on the Monopolies Commission in the UK. And then a summing up at the very end of the conference by Sir Christopher Mason, who was a professor of politics at Glasgow, and who was also a local and regional councillor. He was a champion of the disabled and marginal peoples in Scotland, and he was president of the National Autistic Society. So what we've got at the founding are topics which are very significant, at the same time as speakers who have a foot in the academic world, as well as in the world of practice and policy from the beginning. And to some extent, this kind of reminds us that actually our discipline, our organization, our association was born very much integrated and connected with the world of practice. And that the sort of practitioner and the scholar have been kind of collaborating in various ways right from the beginning. And so when we talk about impact and engagement and so on, nowadays we tend to often think it's driven entirely by ref, but it predates that particular kind of development. So just interesting to kind of have a look at. And when you look at the 1970s, clearly, it was a key decade, not just because BISA was founded in that particular decade, but the fact that BISA was founded in 1975 speaks to something which was going on in the UK, but also in the world. And that was a whole series of kind of crises of various types. We had the emergence of OPEC as a power, establishing itself, inspiring the G77 to demand a new international economic order. In response to that, reaction to that, you had the emergence of the G7 as a way of, if you like, the most developed industrial economies gathering together to head off that radical challenge to distribution of power in the world and so on. The fact of the defeat of the NIEO, the new international economic order, created various kinds of conditions later on, which I would argue led directly to current fragmentation in a different way, probably through the BRICS and the BRICS Plus. But in the 70s also, you had in 73, 74, the emergence of trilateralism. So in addition to the G7, trilateralism was an attempt to pull together what were increasingly distant elements of the post-war order, North America, Western Europe, and Japan. So in many ways, the 1970s sounds a little bit like the current decade through which we're passing. A large number of domestic crises, crises of disorder. In fact, one of the essays in the Trilateral Commission's founding book was a crisis of democracy. But the crisis of democracy then was not to do with right-wing populism, but with very large numbers of counter movements for women's rights, civil rights, and many other kinds of rights revolution, which was demanding greater level of service from the democratic systems, which it could not provide. And there were people talking about government overload. So it's very interesting just to kind of have a look at that decade and what was going on as a precursor to introducing speakers here. So the speakers here today, expert and specialist in their own particular fields, but the 4 dimensions which were mentioned in 1975 at the founding were to do with technology, maritime, the monetary, and the energy areas. And it is a bit odd to think that these were new in 1975, because the Pacific Ocean alone is half the world's surface. Money has existed for a very long time on an international scale. Technological advances and changes, of course, are perennial, and energy, of course, has been a source of many, many conflicts and wars, and particularly in the regions which are blessed with those sorts of resources as well. But I guess in our field, the world, we catch up with the world eventually. And in 1975 was a good moment when some of this was recognized as having something directly to do with the making of foreign policy and the study of foreign policy. So this is a great event today that Juanita and Juliet and Ella and others have organized. And we have, as I said, 4 speakers. If it's okay, we'll go in the order in which was listed on the email. That is Tim Edmunds first, followed by Pedro, and then by Helena, and then Caroline, if that is all right. And I'll just then very briefly introduce the speakers. And we had asked the speakers, or somebody had asked in an email, to sort of address broadly the sort of theme of last 50 years ago up to the present and into the future. So we're given a bit of guidance to say, according to the theme that you're speaking about, in regard to foreign policy in 1975, which was a new dimension then, how has that developed or changed since then? Does your theme, secondly, tell us anything more broadly about the world today, rather than just about the theme in itself? And in terms of the next, thirdly, in terms of the next 50 years, what have we got to look forward to in that particular dimension? Or what do we have most perhaps to fear, given the way in which the world is developing at the moment? So, as I said, we'll stick to the order that was announced in that particular organizing email, and we'll start with Professor Tim Edmunds. Professor Tim Edmunds is a professor of international security at Bristol. He's the head of the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies. He's the co-director of Safe Seas Network on Maritime Security. He's a BISA trustee, and he's a former and founding editor of the European Journal of International Security. And his research interests, appropriately, are in maritime security, ocean governance, transnational crime on the sea, and things like that. And his recent book with Christian Guger is called Understanding Maritime Security, and that was published last year by Oxford University Press. So Tim, over to you, about 10 to 12 minutes on the biggest questions on planet Earth at the moment, and then we'll go through the other speakers and we'll go to a Q&A after everyone has spoken.
10 to 12 minutes, you're going to have to knock me on the head, Inderjeet, because I've probably got a lot more than that. So please do feel free to stop me. I'll see how far I get through the questions. Thank you for inviting me.
Just wanted to leave about 30 minutes for Q&A.
Sure.
So we've got a bit of wiggle room.
Okay, thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Inderjeet, for your kind introduction. So the 1970s, as Inderjeet has said, is a really interesting time in international politics, and no more so than for the oceans, for the maritime domain, and for ocean governance. And one of the reasons for that was because during the 1970s, we see the negotiation of the legal and governance regime which still dominates the ocean today, and that is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The third UN Conference of the Law of the Sea was launched in 1973, and I would love to go back and see what the speaker at the time was talking about with regard to maritime, but I suspect it was to do with some of the issues that were raised by the UNCLOS process at that time. Now, UNCLOS came into was negotiated and agreed in 1982 and came into force in 1994, and it provides the whole regime of ocean governance as we know it today. And so that wasn't present in the 1970s in the same kind of way. And there was still a series of big debates and contentions over the status of the oceans in international politics at that time that has since become more settled, perhaps being contested again today. That's the contention over whether we should treat the seas as a kind of free domain for trade and commerce and activity, whether they should be territorialized in various ways, whether they should belong to states, or whether we should see the oceans as a global commons. And to some degree, the UNCLOS negotiations were about trying to reconcile those three visions, and UNCLOS inevitably was something of a compromise between those three visions. And as I said, it set really the ocean governance regime as we know it for the last 30 or 40 years. So that's one enormous change is the coming into force of UNCLOS and all that has meant. The second, and I think absolutely critical trend to understand during this time is what Swedish researchers have called the blue acceleration. And this is a process really that's taken place since 1980 of a really rapid and intense industrialization of the maritime domain in almost all areas of human activity, in relation to seaborne trade, in relation to fishing and aquaculture, in relation to maritime infrastructures, mass tourism, cruise ships. If you look at graphs of human activity in all of those areas, there's almost an exponential increase between 1980 and today. So the extent to which we are using the seas and dependent on the seas is much more significant even than it was back when I was born in the early 1970s. And in part, that was to do with technological developments such as containerization and so on. But also, the blue acceleration is one of the key causes and consequences of globalization more widely and the globalized economic system we live in today. So we see this enormous intensification of the use of the seas, industrialization of the maritime domain that conditions many of the kind of governance and security challenges that we face in it today. And finally, in response to that, I think when we look back to the 70s and compare it today, we see a much more complex, interlinked and transnational set of challenges around what has become known as the maritime security agenda. That agenda emerged in part in consequence of the responsibilities imposed by states, new responsibilities imposed by states, imposed on states by UNCLOS in terms of managing their own marine resources in their exclusive economic zones and territorial waters, environmental protection, and so on. The need for states to look to build new coast guards and maritime security forces, but also an unsettling of the post-UNCLOS, the immediate post-UNCLOS order that began really in the in the early 2000s. Around concerns around maritime terrorism in the wake of 9/11 and other attacks at sea, terrorist attacks at sea, but most particularly the rise of piracy off the coast of Somalia as well. And we see really an unsettling of the post-UNCLOS maritime security order by the creation of these kind of new or newly rediscovered or newly important challenges like piracy, like the intensification of mass industrialized illegal fishing, like the use of the sea for narcotics and narcotics trafficking, people smuggling, and so on and so on. So we see the rise of a series of non-state challenges to what had become a relatively settled Pacific maritime order at sea based around UNCLOS. So I think there are three of the main things that have changed. What does this examining this dimension reveal about the current global political landscape? Well, I think there's lots of really interesting things to say here. I've only got 10 minutes, so I'll try and go through it really quickly. But I think one of the elements to that is around the nature of the sorts of non-state challenges that I've just mentioned, and how that relates to how we think about security at sea. But also increasingly over the last sort of 5 years or so, perhaps a little bit longer than that, the return of geopolitical and interstate competition in the maritime domain in a way that is really very intense in many parts of the world. That includes particularly state-based conflicts and disputes around that arise from a contestation of the existing maritime order by new maritime powers such as China, such as or at least unconventional maritime powers such as Russia and others. And we see these contestations in various different parts of the world, whether we look at the South China Sea, the Baltic and the North Atlantic, and the rise of what's often called grey zone and hybrid warfare in the maritime domain, threats to subsea cables and other maritime infrastructures, the use of fishing fleets and coast guards to create strategic effect and intimidate or coerce others, the use of the shadow fleet for smuggling sanctioned oil, and indeed the spillover of conflicts from land through proxy forces like we see perhaps with the Houthis. And indeed tomorrow is the second anniversary of the first Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, which I think is indicative of this return to a kind of a geopolitical more intensely competitive geopolitical landscape at sea, but I think is emblematic of somewhat wider trends in global politics too. But I think there's a kind of counter trend we can look at here that also tells us a more positive story about global politics, and I think is particularly visible in the maritime domain, or has been visible in the maritime domain. And that's that when we look at maritime security and how states and other actors have addressed it over the last 15 or 20 years, we see significant nodes of cooperation as well as conflict, collaborative responses, novel collaborative responses, unusual coalitions to address problems such as piracy, for example, such as marine environmental protection, such as illegal fishing. So when we look at the International Maritime Order, or the maritime orders, while it's clearly being challenged in some quite significant ways at the level of high geopolitics in the manner I've implied, nested within that are other kinds of ordering processes that I think are less worrisome and even perhaps quite positive. So we might look at the diverse international coalition to contain Somali piracy, for example. The recent negotiation of the areas beyond national jurisdiction, sometimes called the High Seas Treaty. The aspiration at the United Nations to create 30% of the global oceans as marine protected areas by 2030. Cooperation and negotiations around a plastics treaty and so on. So there are these really, I think, important nodes of cooperation we see in the maritime domain that tell us something about how international politics sometimes works below the level of high geopolitics and even at times of significant geopolitical tension. And I think there's a lot that's interesting to be said around that. How much time do I have, Inderjeet? I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Yeah, 3 or 4 minutes would be fine.
3 or 4 minutes. Well, that leaves me a little bit of time to say something in terms of the future. Oh, sorry. The third thing I'd say in relation to current trends that I think is very interesting is that I think there is a notable decentering of Western actors in many of these activities. I think when we look from the perspective of the West at what's happening at sea, it often looks like a global disorder. I don't think it necessarily looks like that from other parts of the world. On a lot of different measures, the major maritime powers on shipbuilding, on trade, on port size, and so on, are not Western. They're based primarily in East Asia. Key initiatives on maritime security in the UN Security Council and so on have been led by states such as India, rather than by Western states. And I think that shift tells us something more widely too. Right, next 50 years. I think there are three meta trends we need to think about and that are going to shape maritime security and ocean governance over the next 3 years, over the next 50 years, and indeed before. The first is the growing and pressing environmental crisis at sea. In terms of the impacts of climate change, that is going to lead to major, and is already creating major environmental and economic impacts for all of us, but particularly for coastal and island states. Existentially, in the case of some small island states, catastrophic biodiversity loss in the oceans and pollution as well. Those issues are only going to become more urgent in future years and highlight the need for planetary and collaborative solutions to address them. And as I've already implied, I think there are some quite positive indications in that regard, although also some difficulties too. Second, I think that needs to be set against this return of geopolitics to the maritime domain, the rise of non-Western maritime powers who are contesting the current maritime order or orders, expressed through things like naval arms buildups, militarizations of coast guards and other maritime law enforcement agencies and so on, construction of overseas bases and infrastructures, intensified conflicts and disputes at sea. And conversely, of course, these geopolitical tensions make collaborative and cooperative solutions to other kinds of issues, whether they're shared problems like piracy or major global challenges like climate change in the maritime domain, that much more difficult. And I think the interaction of those two trends is going to be very, very important in shaping how ocean governance evolves over the next 10, 20, maybe even further than that years. The final theme interacts with those two, and that's in relation to the rapid development and impact of new technologies at sea. Ports and shipping, maritime trade have become increasingly digitized in recent years. That brings significant economic benefits, but also creates new vulnerabilities in relation to cyber attacks, or the dependence of our societies on maritime infrastructures for the internet, such as subsea data cables and so on. So digitization is a critical trend that's only going to increase in future, but also other technological developments around AI and automation. We can already see that in relation to the impact on conflict and war. If we look at Ukraine, if we look at the in other parts of the world as well. But also there are rapid developments in things like autonomous shipping and so on. The use of AI in all kinds of other areas, such as maritime domain awareness, the processing of large amounts of data to understand what's happening at sea and to inform responses. So there's a very kind of dynamic situation with the impact of various rapidly developing technologies on the maritime domain and on both security threats and responses within the maritime domain that I think is going to interact in some very interesting ways with both the trend towards planetary thinking in the maritime domain, but also this return to geopolitical competition. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That was really interesting, and it's loads of questions come up in my own mind, and I would like, if possible, to ask. But congratulate you on doing quite a lot in a very short space of time. Really helpful. Next, we'll just move straight on to Pedro. Pedro is a lecturer in political economy at Exeter. He's the co-director of the Exeter Centre of Advanced International Studies. He's the co-convener of IPEG, which boasts a longer life than BISA itself. And his focus is particularly on Latin America, but especially on the politics of capital management, flows of capital management, macroeconomic efforts of financial liberalization, drivers of financial nationalism, and so on. So, Pedro, over to you to do the same or similar equivalent to what Tim just did. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for having me and for the invitation. Do you hear me all right? Yeah, okay. So basically, when I got the invitation, I said yes, because it was a great idea, looked very interesting, it was a great opportunity. Then yesterday I was thinking about what I was going to say, and I panicked, of course. So basically, my strategy was going to the past and work a bit on the writings of like Fred Hears was the one that spoke on monetary issues in the original event, and also to the work of Susan Strange. So that's more or less how I'm going to structure my points, especially for the first answer, which is the one that probably it's the one that deserves a bit more of space. Okay, so basically I will divide my exposition here in three parts. Okay, the first one is like paying attention to the work of Fred Hears and Susan Strange and the discussions that were around, let's say, British international political economy at the time. What were the topics that survived? So what are the topics that are still with us and are some sort of a legacy of this 1975 meeting? Then I will try to discuss a bit which one of these topics changed, but these were kind of expected changes or changes within these topics. And finally, what are the new topics, the new aspects that were not there, and now they are quite important for the conversation. Okay, so first, I think there are a few points that are very important in the work of Fred Hears and Susan Strange, and here I'm talking about their work in late 60s and early 70s. I'm not talking about what they write after that, okay? Which is the fact that there was a growing political relevance of the regulation of international money. So that's the moment of the crisis of the Bretton Woods order. There was a moment of politics of exchange rate, discussions on which exchange rate system was more important or was more effective. A lot of debate about drivers and implications of external imbalances. So all these conversations that we have today about US complaining about China and the imbalances, they were already there in the conversation between US and Europe, US and Japan. Also, the growing relevance of non-state actors, so the growing relevance of multinational corporations, global financial markets, as some sort of a threat to democratic institutions or as a threat to the policy space of democratic governments, fed by the fact that there was a bit of an unequal pace of change in international economic systems and international political systems. So basically, politics was struggling to follow the speed of economic changes, and this created a series of problems. There's also the issue of what Strange calls a top currency syndrome. So this difficult alignment between domestic societal needs and the requirements of monetary hegemony in the US. And also, because we are in the British Association, I think it's also important to say something about the difficulties of UK in coping with its decline as a monetary power. And then it's very interesting to see that in the mid-70s, we see discussions about joining or not the European Economic Community, the issue about the credibility of the budget, a Labour government concerned about the credibility of the government and the credibility with financial markets of the budget and so on and so forth. So this is pretty much, these were the topics that were discussed at the time. And within these topics, we can see shifts and changes that kind of follow them. So for example, if you're thinking about empowerment of non-state actors, we have a massive change with the rise of investment managers like BlackRock, the empowerment of risk agencies, and also the impulse to financial deregulation with financial derivatives, for example. So this was something. Also, the issue of external imbalances changes a bit with the rise of China, but also becomes more and more relevant within the EU with the crisis of the Eurozone, and also between advanced and emerging economies. When it comes to the UK, to some extent, we are talking about the same topics. So basically, UK is struggling with the need to get credibility with financial markets and trying to calculate more or less what is the level of policy space that a British government has after the decline of the country as a monetary power. And finally, there was something at the time that was already there, but I think expanded further and further, which is the dissatisfaction with macroeconomic policy making and dissatisfaction with the democratic control over monetary policy making, especially about the role of central banks. So we are still seeing like many clashes, sometimes from the left, nowadays from the right, with the, like central bank independence, central banking autonomy. However, we also experienced shifts that maybe were not really in the conversation in the 70s. And I think, of course, we can use the theoretical tools from the 70s, from British IP, to think about them. But I think they are to some extent new. So, for example, the unconventional monetary policies that follow the global financial crisis and the expansion of the role of central banks. This, to some extent, was there, but I think it changed it qualitatively. Also, we have nowadays the rise of fintech, the rise of crypto assets, and all the concern about monetary sovereignty and to what extent governments will retain their ability to shape the international financial order, or they will gradually lose their upper hand, not only in terms of financial regulation, but also in terms of the control over money itself. We have the laws of influence of the IMF, like a bit around this notion of the centering that Tim said. I think this is quite important in the global south. So the IMF is still important, it's still relevant, but it's not the same IMF as 70s and the 80s. And this says a lot about the state of the global order, the state of international political institutions. There is this interaction between the monetary rise, the financial rise of China, and the dissatisfaction with the role of the dollar. This was already there in the 70s, satisfaction with the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. But I think there was not a clear challenge at the moment, even though there were many concerns in the US. I feel that now the alternatives are gaining a bit more strength. And finally, of course, you have the progress of monetary integration in EU and the UK rupture with EU, which adds further complexity. Okay, so these are, let's say, the main shifts and the evolution of these topics. Okay, and the second question that was posed to me is this question about how do I think that the financial aspect, the monetary aspect can shed light on the global political landscape, which is a massive topic. So basically, what I would suggest maybe that we come back to Susan Strange's work and reflect on what she calls like 4 levels of economic power. So basically, I think we can organize, or we can think about the relevance of financial and monetary aspects for the global political order around 4 dimensions. So the first one is the role of hegemonic countries in shaping the structure of the global economy. So in this sense, I think the monetary aspect sheds light on the future of US hegemony, the contestation of US hegemony, the costs and benefits of currency internationalization, the costs and benefits of being a financial power. And these are questions that should be posed to China, that should be posed to Europe as well. Secondly, there is the issue of interstate cooperation to design minimum rules. So not the competition between states, but the fact that the states need to cooperate or somewhat cooperate to forge minimum standards and to some extent keep business and private actors on hold a bit. And I feel that here we have a growing tension over who controls money supply due to the rise of crypto assets, due to the rise of non-bank credit suppliers, due to the crisis of international organizations like the IMF, like the BIS. Like if you read the recent reports of IMF and BIS, you see a lot of despair, a lot of concern about their role as these kind of protectors of the international financial order. The third point would be the relationship between domestic social groups and the government. Here, again, the monetary aspect, I think, sheds a lot of light on the distributive conflicts and the difficulties that our governments are having to manage distributive conflicts, to formulate a relationship with capital that allows governments to have some space to address democratic demands. We see nowadays these, for example, with all the discussion about taxation in the UK and all the exit threats by capital that are coming from time to time and resonate a lot with the debates that we had in the 70s. And finally, there is the relationship between private actors themselves. So basically, the structural power of large business groups. And here, again, we can think about the potential AI bubble that we are forging and the relationships with debt and the treatment of creditors and debtors, and how these issues that maybe erupt as financial issues, at the end of the day, they reveal power relationships that go beyond finance. And then, I don't know, how is my time?
About a minute or two is fine.
Okay, that's fine. I don't need more than that. So basically, I think we can build upon all these aspects to think about, I don't know, next 50 years and what are the long term. And then, of course, I am an economist by training, so I can make wrong predictions very easily. I'm very comfortable with making mistakes in this part. But I listed some points. I think the main challenge in the strictly financial area is this state control over money. So fintech, crypto assets, and how states will manage that. I think there is an issue which is broader, and I think touches on all the aspects that we're going to discuss this day, which is the institutionalization at the global level. So the loss of power of Bretton Woods institutions, the uncertainty around the rise of China, the volatility of foreign monetary policies by so-called, I don't know, liberal Western powers, the role of big private players. So all these aspects, I think they add a lot of complexity. There is the issue of climate crisis. There's a clear financial implication of that. So basically, as climate emergence becomes more and more evident and the consequences become more evident, this will have a lot of implications for how we do insurance, how we estimate that, how we estimate risk. And we don't know the implications of that. We think we know, but the fact is that when balance sheets will be open, I think we're going to have a lot of surprises about this. And finally, just to maybe add some spice, I think there is the issue of and again, I'm Latin American, but I know that I am in the UK, so I want to talk about that. I feel there is the issue of the future of Europe and the future of UK. The US alliance, in financial, when it comes to the dollar and the financial support, may never come back to normal. And there is a lot of debate about the digital euro. There's a lot of debate about the international role of the pound, the relationship with the global south, the trade agreement between EU and Mercosur, and to what extent Europe and UK can establish a long-term vision for their financial presence, or if they will still be always behind the US in this realm. Yeah. So that's what I had for today. Thank you very much.
That's excellent. That's really interesting. And a lot of, despite looking at a different domain, there are some interesting questions which are in common, I think, between the two talks just delivered. So thanks very much, Pedro, for that. I've got a ton of questions on my piece of paper here also, and maybe I'll be able to amalgamate them at the end for each of the speakers to respond. But thank you very much. We move on to the third speaker, Helena Farrand Carrapico, who's going to talk about the technological realm. Helena is a professor of international relations and European studies at Northumbria. She's a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences. She's a secretary of BISA, so we have continued being steeped in BISA business and affairs among the speakers. And one of her areas of interest in research interest is in the area of cyber crime. And as I say, she's kindly volunteered to talk today about the technological dimension back then, right now, and going forward. So thanks, Helena.
Thank you so much. Can I make sure that everyone can hear me? Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for the invitation. What I want to do today is take us on a very short journey, a 10-minute journey from the Cold War to the age of AI, essentially, to reflect on how technology has shaped foreign policy and how the discipline of international relations has tried, sometimes quite awkwardly, to keep up with technology. So my presentation is a little bit different from the previous two presentations, which were excellent, but my presentation is going to actually focus a bit more on the discipline of international relations and how it's tried to make sense of technology and whether it's failing in certain aspects of it. Just like Pedro, I went back to the original conference and to actually take inspiration from the person who actually did the original talk on technology. His name was Sir Herman Bondi, and as was mentioned before, he was the chief scientific advisor for the Ministry of Defense, and obviously, this presentation is not particularly easy, not just because it's not easy to follow on his footsteps, but also because, 50 years of technology, how do you actually, wrap your head around this? And also because unfortunately, the original, the talks were actually not transcribed. So we actually don't really know what was said in that conference. But I had the possibility of actually reading quite a lot of what Bondi wrote. And most of papers, he was a mathematician, right? He was not from international relations. He was a mathematician and cosmologist. And most of his papers are completely impossible to read. But he did leave us some more generic papers that actually talk about the role of science and the role of science communication. And one of the things he actually, because he obviously knew a lot about technology, and one of the main messages that comes out of his writing is that actually, essentially, that technology can never fix politics, can never fix political problems. And I thought that message was particularly interesting because it actually quite refreshing, because it was said in 1975. And because actually, if we look at the literature that was actually being written, at the IR literature being written at the time, that's not a message that was present at all. So let me start by going back to the Cold War, to the time of the conference. So when the 75 conference took place, obviously, technology had already become synonymous with global strategy. In a nutshell, technologies such as nuclear weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles, reconnaissance and communication satellites, early computers, and of course, the semiconductors that made all that possible, already transformed how states imagine war. So instead of large-scale military mobilizations, foreign policy essentially hinged on second strike capabilities and obviously, much more importantly, on deterrence. And this shift of how states imagine war really led IR scholars to rethink numerous concepts, from cooperation and rationality to risk. But even though technology was already central to strategy, and there you can think about some of the the strategic studies obviously were emerging as a field, the IR literature mostly treated it as essentially as a variable. So either states had technology or didn't have technology or didn't have enough technology. They didn't think of it as something that shaped the very nature of global politics. Essentially, technology was understood through realist lens simply as an enabler of power. And although we are now very aware that technologies are not just, are not politically neutral, and that the Cold War's arms race combined technological competition with propaganda and ideology, unfortunately, very few scholars question how these technologies might shape the nature of power at the time. So in the 70s, technology didn't change the way IR thought about power, it only changed the way states pursued it. When the collapse of the Soviet Union took place, it didn't really just reshape geopolitics, it also led states to rethink the role of technology in that reshaping. So In the 90s, we move away from focusing on nuclear weapons, on intercontinental ballistic missiles, to focus on the emerging technologies that were actually starting to drive globalization. That included the internet, that included different forms of telecommunications, included, of course, biotechnology. And the internet in particular was absolutely revolutionary in this period, not just as a communications technology, but as a global public space, as a space where foreign policies could be contested or supported. And this led to a whole new range of governance questions to emerge. What kind of domain is the internet? Is it a digital version of the global order, or is it something completely different? Is it actually governable? How do you govern something that has no borders? And if it is governable, then who should be doing it? And these questions really pushed states to come up with, it made them actually come to the really important realization, which is that whereas technology was once seen as an extension of their power, now it was increasingly in the hands of private actors and multinational corporations. And the shift towards the governance of technology, however, doesn't mean that the strategic use of that technology in warfare had completely gone away. It hadn't. Technological superiority continued to be incredibly important because it now allowed interventions to be, particularly precise, supposedly ethical, and more importantly, low risk. I'm thinking specifically here about the Gulf Wars in 1991 and 2003. Essentially, what could now be done, wars could now be done entirely from a distance. And in addition, technologies also became important at the time because they were seen as a very clear means to spread democratic ideals, to spread human rights norms, and even market practices. Overall, though, I think it's only fair to say that in the 90s, we see IR shift from the analysis of technology capability to a focus on new governance questions. So similarly to policymakers, we've got scholars like Bühler and Denarmes who began debating questions that actually we're still grappling with today. Things like who runs the internet, how do states regulate it across borders, what should be the relationship between the public and the private sector where technology is concerned. And this really helped to actually give rise to new fields like internet governance and to bring IR closer to other fields that were very interested in technology like STS, Science and Technology Studies. And together, all these scholars started to point out that technology was not just a tool, but that actually internet standards or protocols or infrastructure were actually a form of political power in themselves. Alongside with these scholars, we've got other IR scholars, namely Nye and Cohen, that began discussing ideas of complex interdependence, of global governance, and of new governance regimes. And what they were arguing is that technology and digital communication were actually expected to fundamentally change the nature of interstate power, and that the future of technology governance was likely to be deeply fragmented and multi-stakeholder, where different actors like states and companies and international organizations would all have very different roles. And in addition to that, I really wouldn't be able to actually talk about the 90s without referring to the really important contribution that social constructivists had for this area. So colleagues like Finnemore, Krathorville, Katzenstein really started looking at how norms and identity shaped both technology and technology policy at the time. I'm thinking that, for instance, Martha Finnemore's PhD thesis, which she published in 91, was actually looking specifically at the dissemination of science and technology norms through international organizations. I think she was one of the organizations she was looking at was the OECD. So if we push forward with 9/11, the strategic role of technology, just making sure that I still have time, I have time, with 9/11, technology continued to be particularly important in terms of strategic role, but was really reoriented towards predictive risk management. Surveillance at the time was expanded under the banner of national security, through large-scale databases, through the usage of biometrics, for instance, at borders for border controls. And so in that era, the role of technology was not just to respond, but to actually anticipate security threats. And security became almost entirely dependent on the capacity to collect, to process, to think, to correlate really large amounts of data through different forms of technology. And here we obviously have a very important role for the critical security studies literature with scholars, in particular from the Paris School, like Bigot, who were very, very attentive to the governance of individuals through risk and technological approaches. During this period, we also see cyberspace emerge as an entirely new conflict domain. So the Russian attacks, for instance, on the Estonian and the Georgian critical information infrastructures of 2007, 2008, are a really good indicator of the way states could now use new technologies to bring other countries completely to a standstill. And there, an entire new generation of IR scholars like Rids and Dunn-Cavalty clearly highlighted that actually cyber conflict was not just a problem for computer scientists, but actually a deeply political issue that needed to be theorized in terms of coercion, in terms of norms, in terms of escalation. So since then, essentially over the past 20, 25 years, the IR literature has continued to aspire to the idea that technology is deeply political and should be in itself an object of an IR inquiry. But has this really been achieved? I would say not really. So if on one hand, it has become clear that technology is now central to questions of high politics, on the other hand, however, the main debate that we're currently seeing in the IR literature on technology is not so different from the one we actually were having in the Cold War, but maybe with a bit more technology, essentially. So basically, this echoes very much what Inderjeet was saying in his introduction. So that actually we're very much seeing the echoes, and Tim also mentioned in his presentation, we're very much seeing the echoes of those debates coming back. So of course, we've left behind the discussions on nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles, and now we're focusing on AI, we're focusing on quantum computing, autonomous weapons, we're focusing on cloud computing. But as geopolitics made a comeback, the control over key technologies and over those who produce, those companies who produce those key technologies is being treated as a strategic resource, similarly to the way that actually specific weapons were actually seen during the Cold War. So, for example, the US-China rivalry over companies like UOA, the introduction of export controls on advanced chips, the introduction of controls as well on manufacturing equipment for semiconductors, and the push in the EU for digital or technological sovereignty are actually often being analyzed through a technological solutionist perspective or from a weaponized interdependence perspective. That means that although technology is now fully the terrain in which geopolitical competition is entirely being played out, IR is still missing as a discipline, is still missing out on the opportunity to ask questions that are actually being currently asked by neighboring disciplines, namely on how the design, ownership, governance of these new technologies is constituting the future distribution of power in the international system. And I'll be the first one to raise my hand because I often am, I'm responsible for doing a lot of this. I have written quite a lot about digital sovereignty, and I often tend to have, to write in this fashion. But, and this is my final sentence, really, my final thoughts, for this to happen, there really needs to be a much greater investment on the side of IR in the conceptualization, in the theorization, and the development of methodological approaches to study technology, finally, as a full IR object of study. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's so interesting. A bit mind-boggling as well, and a lot of questions, of course, which could be asked, and I have a number of them on my piece of paper, and look forward to the Q&A, and hopefully colleagues and friends in the audience may ask similar questions as well. But thank you very much, Helena. That was really interesting. Quite a sort of a different kind of presentation compared with the previous two, but I think very interesting all the same. But we'll move on to our final speaker, who is somewhere on my pieces of paper, a million pieces of paper. It's Caroline, who is a professor at Warwick. I've lost I've got so many pieces of paper. I've lost them all. I'm not highly digitized, clearly.
Really happy to introduce myself. If you
maybe you want to say, I'm really sorry. Sorry about that.
Don't worry at all. I totally empathize.
It shows you my incompetence remains always what it was. But
anyway,
please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, so yeah, I'm a professor of the political economy of climate politics, of climate change. And the area that I really focus in is the policies and politics behind trying to reduce emissions in this incredibly complex global sector. So I'm not going to sort of go on about books and things that I've written, because I'll just go straight on, I think, with the presentation. So starting with this question of energy featuring as a sort of a new dimension of foreign policy back in 1975, like some of the others, I'm going to do sort of a little bit of a why and how we understood energy then. And then I'll just start talking about change, because actually, I mean, there's change visible in all of the sectors that we've talked about, but I'd say maybe none more so than in the energy sector, where climate change mitigation, although it's happening at a far slower rate than most people interested in climate mitigation would like to see it happening, it is on policy agendas, and it is causing changes. It is causing clean energy transitions and shifting energy and international relations as a result of that. So I'm just going to be focusing quite a lot on the changes. So, and I also am aware that I'm, stuck in my area, and I'm really hoping that I'm not going to be like going over things that people aren't aware of, that I assume that you're going to know. So please ask me questions at the end if I've skated over something that isn't obvious to you. So obviously back in the 1970s, by that stage already, the world had become increasingly dependent on fossil fuel-based energy. It was the basis for industrialization and economic development. It continues to be so in many parts of the world. It had become, because of the rise in technologies in households, but also in sectors like medical sectors and defense sectors. They all require energy in order to operate these machines. So it had become the sort of lifeblood of everyday life, as it had started to be referred to. But the issue in international relations terms was that fossil fuels were only found in fixed locations. And so what was happening here was that by the 1970s already, the world had divided into those that had access to fossil fuels, the producers, and those who were dependent, the consumers, on those fossil fuel producers. And so you had very uneven power relations. And this is what Susan Strange also was talking about when she was talking about energy as a source of power and influence in the world. Specifically, energy then meant fossil fuels. And of course, you also then there's a lot of literature, which is a very sort of realist, zero-sum literature about these kinds of conflicts and energy relations. But also, interestingly, I want to sort of not focus as much on the sort of conflict side of it and talk a little bit about the degree to which fossil fuels were linked to accepted global models of economic development. And if you look at OECD assumptions today about how countries will grow, there are assumptions still about their relationship to fossil fuels. So then, of course, the 1970s, so in 75, when this BISA conference happened, they'd had the first oil shock. They hadn't had the second one yet. But that revealed then the impact of those dependencies of consumers on producers or importers of fossil fuels. And you could see that in their vulnerabilities to spikes in the cost of oil, the inflationary pressures, the hits to GDP, the hits to household and industry costs who were increasingly dependent. Then the responses then were to really focusing on ensuring greater supply of fossil fuels, partly by setting up the first consumer energy intergovernmental organization, which is the International Energy Agency. And there was also some effort to improve energy efficiency. And I'm going to talk about change now by contrasting that response to the 1970s oil shocks with the response particularly in Europe, to the energy crises that emerged around Russia's second invasion of the Ukraine and all the various sort of policy responses. So the hit to consumer countries was of a similar kind of nature and a similar kind of level by these extreme spikes in the price of gas. But this time the response was partly to increase near-term access to alternative gas sources to Russia, but mainly to frame fossil fuels as insecure sources of energy, which is a really completely about shift to where they were 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and also to double up on the shift towards clean energy, to renewables, to storage, to electrification in heat and transport sectors. And the IEA, which was set up to focus on fossil fuel supply security, has also, as a result of that, shifted its focus to how to ensure transitions. And so the difference, obviously, is that climate mitigation has been on enough political agendas for long enough for energy systems to have started changing. So the very question of what energy is has started to change. And that's partly now so renewables are affordable, they are accessible, they can compete with other sources of energy. Wind and solar are now the fastest growing sources of energy in history. There have been battery innovations around storing electricity, growth in EVs, but there's also been green industrial strategies, mainly in Asian countries, particularly China, which are underpinning GDP growth. So in IR terms, what's interesting is that renewables, because they're seen as domestic, because every country can more or less produce solar and or wind energy, it reduces the degrees of dependence, and increasingly so as domestic renewable systems are developed. But you're also seeing an embedding of renewables and of this sort of clean tech race, as it were. So that was just like a contrast of like 1970s to where we are sort of today-ish. And I'm just going to sort of go down into a little bit more detail on that question of change. So one of the interesting things that's happening is this basic assumption around fossil fuels as the basic basis for growth, for profit, for global influence is starting to come under question. Because with the availability of alternatives to fossil fuel sources of energy and the affordability and accessibility of them, etc., the IEA now estimates that on current policies and current rates of transition, coal and oil demand will peak by 2030 and gas demand will peak by 2035. And so this starts to raise questions around stranded assets. If you think about these sorts of sectors, you put your money in today, but you don't really get your money back for about 20 or 25 years. So this is sort of quite a considerable question. And it raises questions about whose coal, oil, gas assets will be left in the ground. And these questions are ultimately pretty existential for still very powerful fossil fuel producers, countries, and corporations. And it's particularly existential if this trend continues for those that don't diversify. So what you're also seeing is sort of shifting energy power bases. So it used to be that the petrostates were the states that had power and influence in the world. But now there's this new comparison coming up between the electrostate, which is sort of epitomized by China, which is sort of shifting very quickly in that direction, and petrostates, and including in that, obviously, the United States with the sort of shift, I guess, that it's had under Trump. Shifting power bases in terms of China, but also South Korea, increasingly India and Indonesia, moving ahead in sort of the clean tech race. And then other interesting power bases shifts, because if fossil fuels were found in certain parts of the world, so too are the critical materials required to make wind turbines and solar panels and batteries, etc., found in different parts of the world, places like Chile, Argentina, Democratic Republic of Congo, and obviously China. But of course, the question of stranded assets and who is going to lose out if these shifts do continue, if the IEA's estimates end up, coming true. It's very, very powerful global actors, and there is plenty of backlash ongoing at the moment. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then there's sort of two other things I just want to talk about in terms of change. One is just back to Inderjeet and Tim. I think we're both talking about fragmentation, and clearly this is epitomized in the energy sector. Fragmentation in trade with the US and China and what's going on in critical materials. Europe taking the decision to no longer import Russian pipeline gas. New Anglo-Saxon critical material alliances, where there's sort of the idea of friend shoring, so only wanting to be reliant on your friends for your critical material assets. There's a Canada, Australia, UK and US pact that's emerged around that area. And electricity, if we are electrifying heat and transport, electricity tends to be a more regional form of energy than something like oil, which was much more a global form of energy. If trends continue and there is greater degrees of energy dependence for consumer countries as they develop their own renewable electricity systems, it means relatively less possibilities for control over energy, even obviously as reliance on critical materials continues to rise. And of course, the demand for critical materials isn't only in the shift towards clean energy, but it's also in AI sectors and in defense sectors. And just as sort of a footnote on change, I would say maybe more compared to sort of 90s and early noughties, there is a much more recognized and accepted role of the state in intervening in many of these kinds of energy areas, in green industrial strategies, in enabling and managing more just transitions, in developing national energy systems, statecraft in new areas like critical minerals. So there's sort of a definite shift in areas like the EU, even in the UK, towards an acceptance of state interventions. And then now thinking ahead a bit, maybe I shouldn't say everything that's on my sheet in front of me, because I've probably said quite a lot already, but we are at a really interesting inflection point. So there's a rise of cleaner energy can, and already in some areas is facilitating some fossil fuel phase out, but the backlash has been and will continue to be ferocious. These are actors that can afford to have large policy teams, that can afford to communicate very, very widely all sorts of reasons as to why we should not continue in this current trend. So will that stifle the shift to lower emissions renewable-based electricity? And there's some of the literature that's quite interesting at the moment is literature that's trying to think about how policymakers who are interested in lasting climate mitigation need to do more to ensure that policies have positive outcomes beyond emissions reduction in order to take away some of the sting of the anti-climate narratives. Then two more things I'll say. One is in the area of circular economy. In energy, circular economy is particularly relevant, given that you're not reliant on fossil fuels anymore in renewable systems. You obviously, with fossil fuels, you just burn them when you're making energy and they're gone, and then you have to keep importing them. But with the materials and metals that are used to make renewable energy systems, the turbines, the panels, etc., many of the metals and materials can be repurposed. So instead of those extraction just needing to continue on and on, if you do implement circular economy strategies, as is happening in China, in the EU, in corporations like Apple, you start making repurposing and recycling part of how you design your business model. I mean, even interestingly, repurposing is becoming a business in parts of the world that aren't often talked about in this kind of area. So Ethiopia has a big strategy to recycle batteries and export them. And they've now banned imports of petrol engine cars so that they can just be importing EVs so that they can be repurposing those batteries. Those are sort of the changes I thought I would highlight. But before I go, I just do want to say that although this is an incredibly complex area and a lot is changing, I don't want to go away without, of course, saying that the estimates now about the costs of climate change, the economic, the personal, the social costs of climate change are so much more developed. And clearly, if we don't sort out these energy transitions and reducing extraction and all the rest of it, the other sort of sets of possibilities for the next 50 years obviously plainly look an awful lot worse. And I'll leave it at that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and it's a lot to get our heads around in that. A lot to get our heads around. But thank you so much, Caroline, for your wonderful presentation. And, you know, it's so interesting that we have 4 different domains, but so many overlapping issues and concerns and questions and so on. So I'd like to open up to the floor, and I guess people can go into the chat and type in their question. But just to kick us off while people are gathering their thoughts and so on, I just wondered if you were to, I mean, you've talked about the role of the state, role of private actors, role of people as a kind of in democratic societies, and how that has been a challenge. You talked about cooperation as something which is kind of normal, but at the same time is growing levels of competition between different actors and different states and economies, but also conflicts where things are breaking down and it appears to be being broken and remade, perhaps. And then there's the whole issue of fragmentation in what was a kind of increasingly globalized set of relationships into something a little less globalized, but yet interdependent and interpenetrated far more than ever historically, such that economies in the 50s and 60s, which were trading or investing in one another, now are much more deeply embedded, and so much so that if you were to cut those relations off, it would actually have knock-on effects, which would be economically and politically and in other ways catastrophic. And so I guess a question which I'd like to maybe pose to each of you is, in your own domain, what would you say is the biggest actual kind of force factor operating in between cooperation, competition, and outright conflict? Of those 3 ways of seeing, which would you say is the dominant factor which we should look out for in the next decade or more? Cooperation, competition, or conflict? And don't say all of the above, because that's a cop-out. Okay, why don't we go in reverse order? Is that all right? Maybe go to Caroline first, and then we go to Helena and so
on. Right, that's a nice one.
I've hit you twice. Now maybe do you want to have a rest?
No, I'm fine. I don't know. I think that there's something sort of odd in the way that the energy politics is forming a sort of nexus, as many people call it, with climate politics. And so on the one hand, you have got, and sometimes it doesn't feel like it, because often when we hear about global climate change cooperation, we're hearing about it in very kind of negative terms, because not enough is happening quickly enough, and that tends to be what we hear about most. But the fact of the matter is that incredibly powerful actors have tried to make us stop caring about climate change and stop doing something about climate change for 50 years. And yet there is global cooperation on climate change. And so without that being in existence, and without some really critical policy making in countries like Germany and China, which have massively reduced the costs, economic and political, of pursuing cleaner energy. Sort of without those things, I don't think we would be where we are today. So weirdly, although what we hear about is conflict and competition, and might I add that those that oppose climate mitigation are the first ones to tell us about why critical mineral dependencies are bad things. I mean, a lot of their narratives are fueling our debates. So I'm actually going to say that the most important factor is climate cooperation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's very interesting indeed. And I guess there's got some implications. Let's see what other colleagues have to say. Helena?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. I would love to be able to say cooperation, and I was thinking, you know, like Caroline said, competition. Okay, maybe cooperation. I can find something. No, I'm afraid. I think we're completely in the full domain of competition, and I do hope that actually we're not moving into the conflict dimension. I really hope so, but I can only speak to the competition that we've currently find. So it's really about who is competing, really. So obviously, at the moment, access to key technologies are conditional. They're geopolitically instrumentalized. You see the rising conflict in terms of, I mentioned some of the examples I mentioned in terms of specific countries actually putting export controls on specific types of technology to prevent other countries from actually developing those technologies or actually developing new technologies. And so we're definitely fully in the domain of competition, where you have the European Union, for instance, when it develops its digital sovereignty agenda, when it develops its digital sovereignty discourse, it's very clearly saying that actually it is a matter almost of survival, of economic, but also security survival, to be able to actually make sure that we are investing, that the EU is investing in its own industry, in its own technological industry, to be able to guarantee a socioeconomic future, essentially. And it is very much it's almost an us versus them discourse, where it actually says we are actually, because we need to invest in our own industry, that means we're going to disinvest in relations with specific industries, specific countries, in order to prioritize ourselves, essentially. And so I would definitely say that it's really difficult to find cooperation at this stage in terms of it. And in fact, I think that's, if I really make an effort, I think you can find the few places where you can find cooperation is actually at the scientific level. So you still have lots of international scientific projects on technology, where there's lots of cooperation between partners across different countries. But even those are starting to very much be impacted by competition. Thank you.
Interesting. Thank you. Okay, cool. All right, we'll go to Pedro next.
Okay, so this is a very tough question. I think I would propose the following way of answering it. So I think we had a window of opportunity for cooperation on financial matters and monetary matters after the global financial crisis. Unfortunately, I think we lost this window of opportunity. So I would go with competition, because I think, to some extent, echoing what you said, there is a difficult to go into like a full open conflict because of the structural power of the dollar and how the financial order it's organized. On the other hand, maybe echoing Caroline, I would say that for describing, I would go with competition. There is like a lot of tension around dollarization and alternatives to the dollar, and now there's the issue of digital euro. So there's a lot of competition when it comes to describing. When it comes to research agenda, maybe I would push an idea of paying attention to cooperation, because I feel that if, like in the next decades, we are going to have more and more instances from the private sector for like these big investors and big players in the financial sector pushing for an agenda of deregulation and pushing for an agenda of erosion of monetary sovereignty, even in regards to advanced economies like the US, like the EU, and so on and so forth. So it would be interesting to see if states will be able to cooperate at least a bit to protect themselves from this kind of attack, which I think it's a bit new, like the issue of crypto assets, stable coins, fintech, and so on and so forth. So again, description, competition, research agenda, cooperation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And Tim?
Thank you, Inderjeet. Really good question. And I'm going to be really annoying because I'm going to say,
All of the above.
I'm not quite, but I'm going to
okay.
sort of say it in a different way. I suppose my view on this, and I think the oceans are a very good example of this, is that cooperation, competition, and conflict are not necessarily monolithic concepts. So in the same way that the international order is not monolithic, I think when we look at the international order at sea, what we actually see are multiple different orders, some of which are nested within each other, that those orders are fundamentally dynamic and changing and always have been. We're in a particularly acute moment of that at the moment, of sort of renegotiation and contestation. And a lot of this kind of these kind of countervailing forces of cooperation and conflict are to be expected in such a moment. The second thing I would say is it depends in some ways where you're looking. So as I've implied, I mean, I think if you're asking the sort of the question about high geopolitics, about relations between major powers, then clearly the answer is very squarely one of competition. I think if you look down at perhaps at different levels or in different domains, then I think there's much more evidence that there are cooperative, collaborative processes going on. A really good example of that is the BBNJ, the Beyond the High Seas Treaty. I did not think a treaty of that scope and scale and ambition was possible in today's climate. Now, the BBNJ has all kinds of problems associated with it.
Just explain, what is BBNJ?
So the BBNJ is the Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, sometimes called the High Seas Treaty, and it is about creating large areas of the high seas that are marine protected areas. And the issue with the high seas, of course, is that no one state has legal jurisdiction over the high seas. Jurisdiction takes place through the flag state. So the BBNJ establishes a regime where it's a kind of global commons approach to marine environmental protection. It's a fabulously ambitious and exciting endeavor. As I say, has lots of flaws, doesn't pay enough attention to enforcement. There's a lot of issues with it, but I think it's indicative of where we can see really significant kinds of cooperation. I mean, the other thing I would say about this is it depends, cooperation or conflict between whom. So one of the things that competition creates is actually new dynamics of cooperation amongst different constellations of actors. So one of the things we see the rise of, again at sea particularly, are novel, often informal, collaborative formats. One might think of AUKUS or the Quad, for example, as examples of this. I mean, the G7 is a good example of that, but also more ad hoc formats that are set up to deal with particular problems. So the contact group on piracy off the coast of Somalia is a very good example of that. So the question is cooperation where, over what, with whom, and in what format, or competition in those areas. And I think you get different answers to those questions depending on where you're looking. And then the final thing that I would say is that, of course, all this can be, in a sense, predictions a mug's game, particularly in international politics. I mean, all of this can change with a major system shock. A major Taiwan Straits crisis that leads to war between the United States and China. Then I think all bets are off. But I think more generally, we are nested within a maritime order that is determined by the blue acceleration, the maritime industrialization I've talked about, that embeds, that creates interdependencies and dependencies on the oceans, on which all our societies and economies, even in landlocked states, to which they are necessarily tied. And I think that does create a dynamic towards cooperation, even within a wider context of increasing competition and context. So I'm sorry, it wasn't a yes or no answer.
No, well, no, I wasn't expecting that, but I think what it shows is that in each of your responses, the responses of our speakers, there are multiple dynamics simultaneously operating, sometimes at different levels, sometimes within the same particular kind of domain, which means that the fact that we have these four speakers with their expertise in these four really significant areas, it gives us some empirical knowledge, which we may not necessarily have because we specialize in other things. And I guess what it does is it creates a big problem for scholars in the sense that, we're going to be around if these things break out into conflict. But the other thing is, how do we theorize this complexity? And clearly in each of the four and across the four, which are interconnected with one another, you can't talk about energy without talking about the maritime. You can't talk about tech without talking about the others. And you certainly can't talk about the global economy and the monetary systems and so on. And I just wonder, 30 seconds each, as we reach the end, what's the theory which is explaining this complexity? Where's the IR theory which actually deals with that? So unfair, right? I'm allowed because I'm the chair. I don't have to answer anything. I can just pose some questions. Wait, why don't you go first, Tim?
I mean, I've never been a natural theorist, Inderjeet. my immediate reaction would be, it's actually the approach we take in our book, Understanding Maritime Security, because Christian and I argued about this and decided we couldn't come up with an answer, is that we actually wrote a chapter about how to use theory to explain different kinds of challenges and problems. And I think for me, I would see theory as a toolkit to which different approaches can help us with certain kinds of problems and certain sorts of solutions, rather than a kind of meta explanation of everything. Maybe that's not a very good answer for theorists, but for me, as a sort of slightly practically orientated international security scholar, it's one that I find quite helpful.
Okay, thank you. Pedro, 30 seconds.
I'm just a humble political economist, but I think the British tradition of IPE can help us a bit to navigate this with all this commitment to eclecticism and also to the attention to these different sources of structural economic power. So I think it may not offer an answer, but maybe it offers a bit of a roadmap to paying attention to these different sources of power and how they interact with each other, how they support each other, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Yeah, I think probably IP is most suited to that kind of fundamental kind of addressing that issue. Helena?
Thank you. So, like Tim said, different existing theories can obviously explain or try to explain different subsets of the questions that we've been actually focusing on. I am particularly interested within this complexity that we've all been talking. I'm particularly interested in the relationship between the public and the private, and how that actually shapes the concept of sovereignty. And so I've been working on a specific theoretical framework that I think actually is particularly useful, which is regulatory mercantilism, which does actually go back to mercantilism, but actually kind of has a geopolitical twist to it. And I think that actually, 30 seconds doesn't allow me to actually expand on this particularly, but I do think that actually allows me to actually understand the deeply the deep competition that currently is emerging, and how different states are trying to actually regulate specific forms of technology and actually compete with other states, and what that's and I'm particularly interested in the fact that actually, what does it mean that about 90% of technology is actually in the hands of the private sector? So what does that say about the concept of sovereignty? That sovereignty is no longer territorial at all, but it's actually infrastructural, right? And so what are the consequences of this? So if you want to stay here for longer, I'm happy to actually talk about regulatory mercantilism and other theories that could actually explain this complexity that we're dealing with, but I'll leave it at this.
Okay, thank you. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed the talks and the Q&A. And before we started the meeting, I was talking about Juanita's initial email, inviting us to whatever, chair and speak and whatever. Juanita, you wrongly said that the meeting was going to start at 3 o'clock and finish at 5:30. And that was my first question. That sounded like a cruel and unusual punishment. But actually, once we academics get talking, suddenly an hour and a half does not seem quite enough. But nevertheless, I think we've had quite a good set of presentations and ideas and knowledge free of charge put before us. And I really want to say thank you to our speakers, Caroline and Helena, and Tim and Pedro, and to Juanita and to Juliet and Ella for organizing all the series of BISA events to mark the 50th anniversary. And I really enjoyed it. And I have about 100,000 more questions on my multiple pieces of paper, which have confused me completely about Caroline's bio, which I apologize again for. But thank you very much for the audience as well. And thank you. That's it. Bye.
Thank you, Inderjeet, for all the
Thank you very much.